The mortarboard felt heavy on my head as I walked across the stage, my English literature degree finally within reach, after 7 long years of part-time study. At 32, I was older than most of my classmates, but the pride swelling in my chest made every late night of studying while working full-time worth it. I had done it. Despite everything, I had finally graduated. In the audience, I spotted my husband David's face among the sea of proud families. But where I expected to see support, maybe even a smile, I saw only that familiar expression of barely concealed disdain. His arms were crossed, his expensive watch catching the auditorium lights as he checked the time. Again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Catherine Walsh, the dean announced, and I stepped forward to receive my diploma. The parchment was warm in my hands, representing not just an education but a dream I'd carried since I was 8 years old, writing stories in the margins of my notebooks. The applause was polite, scattered. I raised my hand in a small wave toward David, hoping to catch a glimpse of pride, of acknowledgement that his wife had accomplished something meaningful. Instead, he was scrolling through his phone, his BMW dealership polo shirt, a stark reminder of what he considered real success. After the ceremony, I made my way through the crowd of celebrating families, graduates posing for photos with their loved ones, flowers and congratulations filling the air. David was waiting by the exit, keys already in hand. Finally, he muttered as I approached, not bothering to lower his voice. That took forever. Can we go now? I've got a conference call with the West Coast dealers in an hour. David, I just graduated, I said softly, clutching my diploma. I thought maybe we could celebrate just for a few minutes. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my stomach drop. It wasn't indifference, it was active contempt. Celebrate what? Exactly. His voice carried that particular tone he used when he thought I was being ridiculous. A degree in English literature? Emma, you're 32 years old. You spent 7 years and $50,000 to get a piece of paper that qualifies you to work at a bookstore. The families around us were beginning to stare. I felt heat creeping up my neck, the same shame I'd felt countless times before when David decided to educate me about reality in public. I want to be a writer, I whispered, hating how small my voice sounded. This was the first step toward preparing and narrating this story. Took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. A writer? David's laugh was sharp, cutting. Emma, wake up. You're living in a fantasy. You know how many people want to be writers. You know how many actually make it. This whole college thing was just an expensive hobby, and now it's time to get serious about real life. A young woman next to us was hugging her parents, tears of joy streaming down her face as they took photos. Her father was beaming, telling everyone who would listen how proud he was. I watched them with a hollow ache in my chest. I've been patient, David continued, his voice rising slightly. I've supported this little dream of yours long enough. You've got a degree now, great. Time to use it to get a real job. Maybe at the library or something, and start contributing to our household like an adult. I do contribute, I said, finding a spark of defiance. I've been working at the bookstore for 3 years while going to school. I help with the bills. David's eyebrows shot up. Emma, you make $9 an hour shelving books. I bring in 6 figures a year selling cars. Your contribution is what I spend on lunch in a week. The words hit like a physical blow. Around us, the celebration continued, but I felt like I was standing in a bubble of humiliation, separated from all the joy and pride surrounding us. But writing, I tried again, is not a career, David finished firmly. It's a pipe dream. Look, I married you because I thought you had potential. You're smart, you're responsible, you're adequate. But this fantasy has gone on long enough. You're a failure at 32 if you think making up stories is going to pay our mortgage. The word failure hung in the air between us like a curse. I stared at him, this man I'd been married to for 5 years, and realized that somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten how to breathe around him. People are staring, I whispered. Good, David said, straightening his collar. Maybe they'll talk some sense into you. Now come on. I need to prep for that call, and you need to start thinking about real jobs. I've already told my brother you might be interested in the receptionist position at his dental practice. Pays decent, good benefits, normal hours. Time to grow up, Emma. As we walked to his BMW, always his BMW because my 10-year-old Honda wasn't suitable for someone of his status, I caught my reflection in the car's tinted window. The woman staring back looked hollow, clutching a diploma like a lifeline while drowning in someone else's disappointment. David spent the drive home detailing his brother's dental practice, the receptionist duties, the opportunities for advancement if I applied myself properly. His voice became background noise as I stared out the window, watching other families heading to graduation dinners, celebrations, proud moments I would never have. At home, David went straight to his office for his conference call, leaving me standing in our kitchen with my diploma and cap and gown. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of David's animated voice discussing quarterly sales targets. I walked to the bedroom and carefully hung up my cap and gown in the closet, next to David's collection of polo shirts and pressed khakis. The diploma went on the dresser, temporarily until I could figure out what to do with it. David would probably suggest the garage. That night, as David snored beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The word failure echoed in my mind, bouncing off every insecurity I'd ever harbored about my dreams. Maybe he was right. Maybe 32 was too old to chase fantasy. Maybe I was delusional to think I could be a writer. But then I remembered the stories I'd written in college, the ones my professors had praised, the creative writing workshop where other students had said my work made them cry, made them think, made them feel something real. The short story that had won the university's literary prize last year, the one David had dismissed as a participation trophy. I slipped out of bed and padded to the kitchen where my laptop sat on the small desk in the corner. David had bought it for me when I started college, a practical machine for schoolwork, nothing fancy. I opened it now and stared at the blank document screen. For 7 years I'd written papers about other people's stories, analysis, criticism, interpretation, but my own stories, my own voice, had been relegated to notebooks hidden in drawers, snippets written during breaks at the bookstore, dreams deferred until after graduation. Well, I was after graduation now. I began to type. Chapter 1. Sarah Chen had always known she was invisible. At family gatherings, she was the one who helped in the kitchen while her cousins discussed their promotions and engagement rings. At work, she was the reliable one who stayed late to finish other people's projects while they left for happy hour. Even in her own marriage, she felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life. But ghost, Sarah was about to discover, had the advantage of being able to walk through walls. The words flowed like water breaking through a dam. I wrote about Sarah's suffocating marriage to a man who saw her as a decoration rather than a person. I wrote about her job at a nonprofit where her innovative ideas were consistently credited to her male supervisor. I wrote about the moment Sarah realized that being invisible wasn't a curse, it was a superpower. By 3 a.m. I had written 12 pages. By 5 a.m. I had outlined the entire novel. When David's alarm went off at 6:30, I was already in the shower washing off the exhaustion and the revelation with equal intensity. "You look tired," David observed over breakfast, not looking up from his phone as he scrolled through car inventory. I started writing again," I said, testing the words. "Writing what?" "A novel." David's thumb paused on his screen. He looked up at me with that familiar expression of patient exasperation. "Emma, we talked about this yesterday. Remember? Real job. Real life, real contribution." "I remember you talking," I said quietly. "I don't remember agreeing." Something shifted in David's face. "Excuse me," I said. "I don't remember agreeing to give up writing." David set down his phone with deliberate care. "Emma, I thought we settled this. You're not a college kid anymore. You can't just play pretend for the rest of your life. It's not pretend if I actually do it." "Do what?" "Write a book." "And then what?" "Submit it to publishers who will reject it like they reject thousands of other wannabe writers every day." "Emma, you're setting yourself up for disappointment." I poured myself another cup of coffee, surprised by how steady my hands were. "Maybe, but it's my disappointment to set up." David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the kitchen floor. "Fine. You want to waste more time on this fantasy? Fine. But but don't expect me to support it. Don't expect me to pretend it's anything other than what it is, a 32-year-old woman who refuses to grow up. He grabbed his keys and headed for the door, then paused. And Emma, when this little writing experiment fails, and it will fail, don't come crying to me about how unfair the world is. Some of us live in reality. The front door slammed behind him, leaving me alone with my coffee and the echo of his words. When this little writing experiment failed, I walked back to my laptop, still open on the kitchen counter, still showing those 12 pages I'd written in the dark hours of the morning. Sarah Chen's story stared back at me, waiting. Maybe David was right. Maybe I would fail. Maybe publishers would reject my work. Maybe I was too old, too inexperienced, too naive about the publishing world. But as I read through what I'd written, I realized something important. Failure was only devastating if you let someone else define it for you. I opened a new browser tab and began researching literary agents. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. David left for work each morning with pointed reminders about real jobs and grown-up responsibilities. I worked my shifts at the bookstore, came home, and every evening, Sarah Chen's world expanded, her story deepening, her journey toward self-discovery becoming more complex and nuanced. At the bookstore, I found myself paying attention to the publishing industry in a way I never had before. I noted which books were flying off the shelves, which authors were doing readings, what kinds of stories people were hungry for. My manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, noticed my increased interest. "You thinking about changing careers?" she asked one afternoon, as I straightened the fiction section. "You've been asking a lot of questions about the business side lately." "Actually," I said, surprising myself with my honesty, "I'm writing a novel." Mrs. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been running the bookstore for 20 years. "What kind of novel?" "Women's fiction, about a woman who discovers her own power after years of being overlooked." "Sounds personal." I paused in my shelving. "It is. Good," Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly. "The best books always." "You need any help understanding how this business works?" "You ask me. I've seen a lot of authors come and go. The ones who make it aren't necessarily the most talented, they're the most persistent." That night, I told David about my conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez. He was reviewing sales reports at the kitchen table, occasionally making notes in red ink. "Your boss is just being nice," he said without looking up. "Of course she's going to encourage your writing. You probably sell more books when you're enthusiastic about them." She offered to help me understand the publishing industry. "Emma," David finally looked up, his expression weary. "Listen to yourself. You're getting career advice from someone who works retail. Mrs. Rodriguez runs a bookstore that barely breaks even. You want to take business advice from someone who can't even make a profit selling other people's books." The criticism stung because there was just enough truth in it to dig deep. The bookstore was struggling, had been for years as online retailers and chain stores squeezed out independent shops. Mrs. Rodriguez worked long hours for little pay, driven more by love of books than business sense. But what David saw as failure, I was beginning to see differently. "She loves books," I said quietly. "She's created a place where people can discover stories they never would have found otherwise. She's built a community. She's built a business that's hemorrhaging money," David countered. "That's not love, Emma. That's poor judgment." "Just like this writing thing." I closed my laptop and stood up. "I'm going to finish my novel. And then what? And then, I'm going to try to get it published." David leaned back in his chair, studying me, with the same expression he probably used when evaluating a customer's trade-in value. "You know what? Fine. Do it. Write your little book. Submit it to agents and publishers. Let them reject it. Maybe then you'll finally understand what I've been trying to tell you, which is that dreams are for people who can afford them, and we can't." But as I lay in bed that night, listening to David's steady breathing, I realized that David was wrong about one crucial thing. Dreams weren't a luxury for people who could afford them. Dreams were a necessity for people who couldn't afford to live without them. And I couldn't afford to live without mine. The next morning, I woke up before David's alarm and went straight to my laptop. Sarah Chen was waiting for me, and her story was far from over. Neither was mine. 3 months into my secret writing life, I had developed a routine that felt both thrilling and dangerous. Every morning at 5 a.m., while David showered and prepared for another day of selling luxury cars to people who wanted to feel important, I would slip out of bed and write for 2 hours before my shift at the bookstore. My novel had grown to Sarah Chen's story was becoming more complex, more layered, more real with each chapter. She had quit her nonprofit job, started her own consulting firm, and was slowly learning to trust her own voice after years of being silenced. In many ways, Sarah was becoming the woman I wanted to be. "You're distracted lately," David observed one evening over dinner. He'd picked up Thai food on his way home, the same routine we'd fallen into years ago when cooking felt like too much effort after long days. "Everything okay?" I looked up from my pad Thai, realizing I'd been mentally working through a plot problem, instead of listening to his recap of the day's sales numbers. "Sorry, just tired. Maybe you should cut back your hours at the bookstore." I've been thinking about what I said before, about my brother's dental practice. The position is still available, and honestly, Emma, the pay would be so much better. You could work normal hours, have weekends free. "I like the bookstore," I said, which was true. More than that, I loved being surrounded by stories, by the possibility that existed between book covers. Mrs. Rodriguez had been true to her word, sharing insights about the publishing industry, lending me books on craft and business, encouraging my progress. "You like it because it's easy," David said, not unkindly but with the certainty of someone who believed he understood my motivations better than I did. "It's comfortable, but comfort doesn't pay the mortgage or build a future." What David didn't know was that my mornings at the laptop had given me something I'd forgotten I could feel: excitement about my own potential. Every day I discovered something new about Sarah's world, about storytelling, about my own capabilities as a writer. The bookstore wasn't just a job anymore, it was research, education, inspiration. "I'll think about it," I said, because it was easier than explaining that his definition of success and mine were no longer aligned. The next morning brought a breakthrough. I'd been struggling with Sarah's relationship with her ex-husband in the novel, trying to find the right balance between his manipulation and her gradual awakening to it. As I wrote, I realized I was drawing from my own experience in ways that made the story more authentic, more emotionally resonant. "You're being dramatic," Richard said, his voice carrying that particular tone that made Sarah feel simultaneously foolish and furious. "I'm just trying to help you see reality. Not everyone can be a dreamer, Sarah. Someone has to pay the bills." Sarah looked at her husband across their breakfast table, noting how he always positioned himself as the practical one, the responsible one, the adult in their relationship, as if dreaming and responsibility were mutually exclusive, as if imagination was a character flaw rather than a strength. "What if my dreams pay the bills?" she asked quietly. Richard's laugh was sharp. "With what? Your nonprofit salary? Face it, honey, dreams don't translate to dollars." But as Sarah watched him scroll through his phone, dismissing her with the ease of long practice, she realized that some things were worth more than dollars, like self-respect, like hope, like the possibility of becoming who you were meant to be. I read the passage over several times, struck by how clearly Sarah's voice was emerging, and how much she sounded like the woman I was becoming in these early morning hours. The woman who refused to be diminished by someone else's limited vision. At the bookstore that afternoon, Miss Rodriguez noticed my energy immediately. "You look like someone who just figured something out," she said, sorting through a box of new releases. "I think I did. The novel is really coming together. I'm starting to understand what it's actually about. Which is," I considered the question, "a woman learning that other people's opinions of her dreams don't determine their value." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. "Sounds like you're writing what you need to read. Is that bad?" "It's perfect. The best novels are conversations between the writer and themselves. You figure out what you're trying to say by saying it." That evening, David was in an unusually good mood. He'd sold 3 cars, including a high-end BMW, to a young tech entrepreneur who'd paid cash. David always felt validated by customers who reminded him of who he thought he was: successful, sophisticated, important. "Great day today," he announced, loosening his tie as he settled into his recliner. made more in commissions today than you make in 3 months at the bookstore. The comparison stung because it was true. David's income dwarfed mine, and he never let me forget it. But lately, his financial superiority felt less like a personal failing, and more like a different set of priorities. That's great, I said, and meant David's success at work meant he was happy at home, which meant less criticism of my choices. I was thinking, David continued, reaching for the remote. Maybe it's time we started talking about kids. I mean, we're both getting older, and my income can definitely support a family now. You could quit the bookstore, focus on being a mom. Might be good for you to have something real to focus on. The words hit me like cold water. Children. I wanted children, had always assumed we'd have them eventually, but the timing of David's suggestion felt calculated, strategic, a way to ensure I never had time or energy for writing again. I'm not ready yet, I said carefully. When will you be ready? You're 32, Emma. Your biological clock isn't going to wait for you to figure out what you want to be when you grow up. I know what I want to be. I want to be a writer. David's good mood evaporated instantly. We're back to this again? I thought you'd gotten it out of your system by now. It's not something to get out of my system. It's who I am. No, David said firmly, turning to face me fully. It's a hobby that's gotten out of hand. You want to know who you are? You're my wife. You work at a bookstore. You have responsibilities to our marriage, to our future. This writing thing is just an excuse to avoid growing up. What if I'm actually good at it? David's voice took on the patient tone he used when explaining obvious things to slow customers. Do you know how many people think they're good at writing? Do you know how many actually are? The chances of you being special enough to make it as a writer are basically zero. But what if they're not zero? They are. And even if they weren't, which they are, the smart thing would be to focus on building a stable life instead of chasing fantasies. I make good money. We have a nice house. We could have a good life if you'd just accept reality. That night, I lay awake thinking about David's vision of our future. Him selling cars, me raising children. Both of us settled into the kind of comfortable, predictable life that so many people wanted. Safe, secure, ordinary. The problem was, I was beginning to realize that ordinary felt like death to me. At 5 a.m., I was back at my laptop, but instead of continuing Sarah's story, I opened a new document and began researching literary agents. Miss Rodriguez had explained the process: finish the novel, write a query letter, research agents who represented your genre, submit, and wait for responses. It seemed both impossibly complex and surprisingly straightforward. Like any other business, once you understood the rules, I bookmarked agent websites, read their client lists, studied their submission guidelines. Some wanted query letters only, others wanted the first 5 pages, or the first chapter, or a synopsis. The requirements varied, but the underlying message was consistent. If your work was good enough and fit their needs, they would be interested. The key was making sure your work was good enough. For the next 6 weeks, I threw myself into revising my novel with an intensity that surprised me. I joined online writing forums, read craft books during my lunch breaks, took notes on technique and structure and character development. My secret writing life expanded beyond the early morning hours, spilling into afternoons and weekends whenever David was occupied with work or sports on television. The novel evolved from a simple story about a woman leaving her marriage into something more complex, an exploration of how we learn to value ourselves when the people closest to us don't. Sarah's journey became less about escaping her husband and more about discovering her own worth independent of his opinion. You seem different lately, David observed one Saturday morning over breakfast. More, I don't know, confident, I guess. Is that bad? Not bad, just different. You seem less concerned about things that used to worry you. He was right. The constant anxiety about disappointing him, about not being successful enough or practical enough or realistic enough, had faded. My secret writing life had given me a private sense of accomplishment that his criticism couldn't touch. Maybe I'm just settling into married life, I said, which was technically true if you considered that I was settling into the reality that my marriage and my dreams existed in completely separate spheres. Good, David said. I was worried for a while that you were going through some kind of crisis, but you seem more settled now. If only he knew that my apparent serenity came from finally understanding that his approval wasn't necessary for my happiness. 2 months later, I typed the words "the end" on my novel. 3,020 pages, 85,000 words. Sarah Chen's complete journey from invisibility to self-possession. I stared at the screen for a long time, hardly believing I'd actually finished an entire book. That afternoon at the bookstore, I told Mrs. Rodriguez about reaching the end. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Surreal, like I proved something to myself that I wasn't sure I could prove." Now comes the hard part, writing the query letter. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head, learning to believe it's good enough to share with the world. She was right. For weeks I revised and polished, second-guessing every chapter, every scene, every line of dialogue. The novel felt both too long and too short, too simple and too complex, too personal and too universal. I read it obsessively, finding new flaws each time. "You're overthinking it," Miss Rodriguez said, when I confessed my anxieties. "At some point, you have to trust that you've done your best work and let other people decide if they connect with it. What if they don't? Then you write another book." "But Emma, what if they do?" That question haunted me as I crafted my query letter, researched agents, prepared submission materials. What if they did connect with it? What if Sarah's story resonated with other people the way it had resonated with me while writing it? What if David was wrong about my chance? On a Tuesday morning in November, I sent my first query letter to a literary agent in New York, who represented women's fiction. The email felt momentous and anticlimactic simultaneously. Years of dreaming and months of work, reduced to a brief message sent into the digital void. I didn't tell David. By then my writing life had become so compartmentalized, from my marriage, that it felt like I was living two completely separate existences. In one I was David's wife, working at a bookstore, gradually accepting that my dreams were impractical. In the other I was a novelist, someone who had created an entire world from nothing, someone who might actually have a future as a writer. The two lives coexisted uneasily, like parallel universes that occasionally intersected, but never quite merged. 3 days after sending my first query, I received my first rejection. It was form letter, polite but impersonal. "Thank you for your submission, but this isn't quite right for our list." The rejection stung less than I'd expected. Maybe because I'd prepared myself for it, or maybe because I'd already sent out 5 more queries and had backup plans in motion, or maybe because finishing the novel had already given me something no one could take away, proof that I could do what I'd always dreamed of doing. David never asked about my writing anymore. I think he assumed I'd given up when I stopped mentioning it. His relief was palpable. One less source of conflict in our marriage, one less area where we fundamentally disagreed about what constituted a worthwhile life. What he didn't know was that I hadn't given up. I'd simply learned to protect my dreams from his criticism by keeping them private. As winter approached and my query submissions accumulated rejections alongside requests for partial manuscripts, I realized that David had been right about one thing. The publishing industry was brutal, unpredictable, and largely indifferent to individual dreams. But he'd been wrong about something more important. That wasn't a reason to stop trying. It was just another part of the process. The email arrived on a Wednesday morning in February, exactly 8 months after I'd sent my first query letter. I'd received 43 rejections by then, ranging from form letters to personalized notes, suggesting the market wasn't ready for my story. I'd grown accustomed to the disappointment, the way hope would surge when I saw an agent's name in my inbox, only to deflate when I read the polite decline. But this email was different. "Dear Emma, I read your query for The Invisible Woman with great interest. Your premise is compelling, and your voice comes through clearly even in this brief description. I'd love to read your full manuscript. Please send it as an attachment at your earliest convenience. Best regards, Jennifer Martinez, Literary Agency." I stared at the screen for a full minute, rereading the message to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. A full manuscript request. After 8 months of rejections, someone actually wanted to read my entire novel. My hands were shaking as I attached the document and hit send. Then I sat back in my kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. Someone in New York, a real literary agent, thought my work was worth her time. David was already at work, which meant I had the house to myself to process this moment. I called in sick to the bookstore, something I'd never done unless I was actually ill, and spent the day researching Jennifer Martinez online. She was relatively young, maybe 35, with an impressive client list of women's fiction authors. Several of her clients had hit bestseller lists. One had won major literary awards. The possibility that I might join their ranks felt both thrilling and terrifying. "You look like you won the lottery," Mrs. Rodriguez observed when I returned to work the next day. "An agent requested my full manuscript." Mrs. Rodriguez's face lit up. "Emma, that's wonderful news. Which agent?" I told her about Jennifer Martinez, and she nodded approvingly. "Good reputation. Smart about the market. If she takes you on, you'll be in excellent hands." "If she takes me on." "When she takes you on," Mrs. Rodriguez corrected firmly. "I've been watching you write this book for months. I've seen your dedication, your growth, your willingness to revise and improve. That kind of commitment shows in the work." That evening at dinner, I struggled to contain my excitement. David was telling me about a difficult customer who demanded unrealistic concessions on a BMW lease, and I found myself only half listening. My mind kept drifting to Jennifer Martinez's email, to the possibility that my novel might actually find its way into the world. "You seem distracted again," David noted, cutting into his steak. "Work okay?" "Work's fine," I said, then made a decision that surprised me. "Actually, I have some news. A literary agent requested my full manuscript." David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Your what?" "The novel I've been working on. An agent in New York wants to read the entire thing." David set down his fork carefully. "Emma, I thought we'd moved past this writing thing." "We never moved past it. You just stopped asking about it. Because I assumed you'd gotten it out of your system." David's voice carried that familiar note of barely controlled frustration. "How long have you been working on this book?" "About a year." "A year?" David's volume increased. "You've been secretly writing a book for a year?" "It wasn't secret. I just didn't tell you about it because you made it clear you thought it was a waste of time." David stood up abruptly, beginning to pace around our small dining room. "Emma, this is exactly what I was afraid of. You're living in a fantasy world. One agent asking to read your book doesn't mean anything. Do you know how many manuscripts agents read every year? How many they actually represent?" "No, but..." "Neither do I, but I guarantee you the numbers are terrible." David stopped pacing and faced me directly. "You're setting yourself up for disappointment. Again. And I'm tired of watching you chase these impossible dreams instead of building a real life." "What if it's not impossible?" "It is impossible. Emma, look at yourself. You work in a bookstore. You have no connections in publishing, no experience in the industry, no platform or following. You're a 33-year-old nobody from suburban Connecticut who thinks she can compete with professional writers." The words hit their intended target. I felt the familiar shrinking sensation that came with David's reality checks, the way his certainty about my limitations made me question my own perceptions. But this time, something was different. This time, I had Jennifer Martinez's email in my inbox, proof that at least one industry professional disagreed with David's assessment. "Maybe you're right," I said quietly. "Maybe nothing will come of it." "I know I'm right," David said, sitting back down and returning to his dinner. "And the sooner you accept that, the sooner we can focus on building an actual future together." But as David launched into his plans for our future, his promotion track at the dealership, our eventual move to a larger house, the children who would give me something meaningful to focus on, I found myself thinking about Jennifer Martinez reading my novel at that very moment. Somewhere in New York, a stranger was discovering Sarah Chen's story, following her journey from invisibility to self-possession. Whether David believed in that story or not, 2 weeks passed with no response from Jennifer Martinez. I checked my email obsessively, analyzing every spam message and newsletter as if it might contain life-changing news. David, meanwhile, had returned to his previous assumption that my writing phase was over, discussing his brother's dental practice again with renewed enthusiasm. "I talked to Mike today," he announced one evening. "The receptionist position is still available. He said he'd be willing to interview you next week if you're interested." I'm not sure I'm ready to leave the bookstore yet. Why? You've been there 3 years and there's no advancement opportunities, no career growth. Mike's practice is expanding. There could be real opportunities for someone willing to apply themselves. What David didn't understand was that leaving the bookstore felt like abandoning not just a job but a community. Miss Rodriguez had become a mentor, the customers had begun to feel like friends, and the environment kept me connected to the literary world I was trying to enter. Can I think about it? Of course, David said, but his tone suggested my thinking should lead to the obvious conclusion. Just don't think too long. Good opportunities don't wait forever. On a Thursday afternoon, as I was helping a customer find a book for her book club, my phone buzzed with a new email notification. I glanced at the screen and saw Jennifer Martinez's name, my heart immediately racing. Dear Emma, I finished reading The Invisible Woman this morning, and I have to tell you, I was completely absorbed. Your protagonist's journey is both deeply personal and universally relatable. You've crafted a story that feels both intimate and important. I'd love to discuss representing you. Are you available for a phone call tomorrow afternoon? Best, Jennifer. I read the email 3 times before it fully registered. Jennifer Martinez wanted to represent me. A real literary agent with real clients and real connections wanted to take on my novel. Emma, the customer was looking at me with concern. Are you okay? You look pale. I'm fine. I managed, though I felt anything but fine. I felt like I was floating, like the ground had shifted beneath my feet and I wasn't sure which way was up. Mrs. Rodriguez, I called across the store. Can you help Mrs. Patterson find the book club selection? I need to make a phone call. Mrs. Rodriguez took one look at my face and smiled knowingly. Good news? Jennifer Martinez wants to represent me. I knew it. Mrs. Rodriguez clapped her hands together. I absolutely knew it. Go, call her back. I'll handle things here. I stepped into the small office behind the counter and called Jennifer Martinez's number with trembling fingers. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and professional. Emma, I'm so glad you called. I have to tell you, I've been thinking about your novel since I finished it. Sarah's story really stayed with me. For the next 30 minutes, Jennifer outlined her plans for my book. She talked about editors who might be interested, publishing houses that were looking for exactly this kind of story, marketing strategies that could help the book find its audience. She spoke about my novel as if it was already a published book, as if its success was simply a matter of finding the right path to readers. There's just one thing, Jennifer said as our conversation wound down. The market is very competitive right now and we'll need to be strategic about our approach. I'll want to work with you on some revisions before we go out on submission. Revisions? Nothing major, but there are some areas where we can strengthen the character development, tighten the pacing, really make sure the emotional arc lands with maximum impact. Are you open to that? Absolutely. Wonderful. I'll send you my representation agreement and some editorial notes later today. Welcome to the team, Emma. After hanging up, I sat in the bookstore office for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. I had a literary agent. My novel was going to be submitted to publishers. I was actually really a writer. The drive home felt surreal. I kept expecting to wake up, to discover that the phone call had been an elaborate dream, but Jennifer's email was still in my inbox, her representation agreement already waiting for my signature. David was in the kitchen when I walked in, standing at the counter with takeout menus spread in front of him. Chinese or Italian? He asked without looking up. David, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, I need to tell you something. If it's about dinner, just pick something. I'm starving. Jennifer Martinez wants to represent my novel. David looked up slowly. What does that mean? Exactly. It means she's going to submit it to publishers. It means my book might actually get published. David set down the takeout menus, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker. Emma, we talked about this. One agent doesn't mean. This is one of the top agents in New York, I interrupted. She has clients on bestseller lists. She thinks my book can sell. And what happens when it doesn't? When no publisher wants it? The question I'd been asking myself for weeks. suddenly seemed less important than the question David wasn't asking. What happens if it does sell? I don't know, I said honestly, but I'm going to find out. David studied my face for a long moment, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. What he saw there seemed to disturb him. This is really happening, isn't it? He said quietly. Yes, it's really happening. David sat down heavily at the kitchen table. Emma, I need you to think carefully about what you're doing. Publishing is a business full of rejection and disappointment. Even if your book gets published, most books fail. Most authors never make enough money to quit their day jobs. I know that. Because you look like someone who's already planning their acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize. His words stung because there was truth in them. I was getting ahead of myself, letting possibility eclipse probability, but for the first time in my adult life I felt like possibility was enough. Maybe I am getting carried away, I admitted, but maybe getting carried away is exactly what I need right now. David shook his head slowly. I hope you know what you're doing, Emma. I really do. Because when this falls apart, and it will fall apart, I don't want to be the one who has to pick up the pieces. That night, as David watched television and I reviewed Jennifer's representation agreement at the kitchen table, I realized that our marriage had reached a turning point. David saw my potential success as a threat to our stability. I saw his lack of support as a threat to my dreams. For the first time since our wedding 5 years earlier, I wondered if we wanted fundamentally different things from life. But as I signed Jennifer Martinez's representation agreement and scanned it back to her, I decided that was a question for another day. Tonight, I was a writer with an agent. Tomorrow, I would start becoming the writer I was meant to be. Working with Jennifer Martinez was like having a master class in professional writing. Her editorial notes arrived 3 days after I signed the representation agreement. 15 pages of detailed suggestions that transformed my understanding of my own novel. She didn't just point out problems, she explained the underlying craft reasons behind each revision, teaching me to see my work through the eyes of industry professionals. The opening needs to grab readers faster, she wrote about my first chapter. We need to see Sarah's dissatisfaction with her life more clearly in the opening pages. Consider starting with a scene that shows her invisibility in action, rather than telling us about it. I threw myself into the revisions with an intensity that surprised me. Every morning at 5 a.m. I was at my laptop, implementing Jennifer's suggestions, strengthening character motivations, tightening dialogue, cutting unnecessary scenes. The novel was becoming leaner, more focused, more powerful. David noticed the change in my routine immediately. You're up even earlier now, he observed one morning, finding me at the kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee at 6:30 a.m., working on revisions. Jennifer wants the book to be as strong as possible before we submit to publishers. Right. The agent. David poured himself coffee, his movements deliberately casual. How long is this revision process supposed to take? A few months, maybe, depends on how quickly I can implement her suggestions. And then what? Then she submits it to editors at publishing houses. David sat down across from me, his expression serious. Emma, I've been doing some research on publishing success rates. Do you know that less than 2% of manuscripts that get submitted to publishers actually get published? I looked up from my laptop. Where did you read that? Multiple sources. And of the books that do get published, most sell fewer than 500 copies. The chances of making a living as a novelist are basically non-existent. I know the odds are challenging. Challenging. David's voice rose slightly. Emma, they're not challenging. They're impossible. You have a better chance of winning the lottery than making money as a writer. Maybe it's not just about money. Everything is about money, David said firmly. Money pays our mortgage, money buys groceries, money funds retirement accounts and emergency saving. Dreams don't pay bills. I closed my laptop slowly. David, I appreciate that you're concerned about our financial future, but this matters to me in ways that go beyond money. Like what? The question caught me off guard. How could I explain the satisfaction of creating something from nothing, the joy of solving narrative problems, the sense of purpose I felt when working on my novel? How could I describe the feeling of being truly myself for the first time in years? Like feeling proud of who I am, I said finally. David's expression softened slightly. Emma, you should be proud of who you are. You're a good wife, a responsible person, someone who contributes to our relationship and our community. You don't need to publish a book to be valuable. But I want to publish a book. I want to see if I can do it. And when you can't, when this agent stops returning your calls because no publisher wants your novel, what then? The question hung in the air between us. I didn't have an answer because I was refusing to consider that possibility. For the first time in my life, I was choosing hope over pragmatism, dreams over security. I guess I'll figure that out if it happens. David studied my face with the expression he usually reserved for customers who wanted to negotiate unrealistic deals. You're really going to do this, aren't you? You're going to chase this fantasy no matter how much evidence suggests it won't work. Yes, I said, surprising myself with my certainty. I am. David nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd suspected. Okay, but Emma, when this doesn't work out, I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me you'll accept reality and move on. No more novels, no more agent submissions, no more chasing the impossible. Promise me you'll focus on building a real life with me. The request felt like a trap, but also like an opportunity for honesty. I can't promise that. Why not? Because if this one doesn't work, I'll probably write another one. David's face darkened. Emma, you can't spend the rest of your life writing books that nobody wants to read. Somebody wanted to read this one. Jennifer Martinez did. One person. Out of how many agents you contacted? 40, 50, 44. So 43 people rejected your work, and you're building your future on the opinion of one person who might be wrong. I reopened my laptop, returning to my revisions. Maybe she is wrong, but maybe she's right. And I'd rather find out than spend the rest of my life wondering. Over the next 2 months, David's skepticism evolved into something more troubling, active sabotage disguised as concern. He began forwarding me articles about authors who'd struggled financially, blog posts about the impossibility of breaking into publishing, statistics about the failure rate of debut novels. Every conversation became an opportunity to remind me how unlikely my success was. Meanwhile, my novel was transforming under Jennifer's guidance. The revisions were extensive, but enlightening. I was learning to trust my instincts, while also understanding how those instincts could be refined and strengthened. Sarah's story was becoming more nuanced, more emotionally complex, more commercially viable. You're getting stronger as a writer, Mrs. Rodriguez observed during one of our conversations at the bookstore. I can see it in how you talk about the work now, more confident, more professional. Jennifer's been an incredible teacher. I feel like I'm finally understanding how novels actually work, and how's David handling all this? I hesitated. Miss Rodriguez had become one of the few people who knew about my writing journey, and her question touched on something I'd been trying not to think about. He's struggling with it, I admitted. He thinks I'm being unrealistic. Maybe he's scared. Of what? Of what happens if you succeed? The observation hit me like a revelation. I'd been so focused on David's concerns about my potential failure that I hadn't considered his fears about my potential success. What would happen to our dynamic if I became a published author? How would our relationship change if my income suddenly rivaled or exceeded his? Do you think that's fair? I asked. Being afraid of your spouse's success? Mrs. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, straightening books on the shelf beside us. I think fear makes people do things they wouldn't normally do, and I think success changes relationships, whether we want it to or not. That evening I found David in his office, reviewing sales reports for the month. His desk was covered with spreadsheets and commission calculations, the tools of his professional success. Can we talk? I asked from the doorway. About what? About us. About how my writing is affecting our marriage. David gestured to the chair across from his desk. I've been wanting to have this conversation too. I sat down, noting how the setup felt like a business meeting rather than a marriage conversation. Mrs. Rodriguez thinks you might be afraid of what happens if I succeed as a writer. Mrs. Rodriguez doesn't know anything about our marriage. But is she right? Are you afraid of my success? David leaned back in his chair, considering the question. Emma, I'm afraid of what this obsession is doing to you. You're not the same person I married. How am I different? You're secretive, you're you're living in a fantasy world instead of focusing on our real life together, and now you're making decisions about our future based on the opinions of strangers instead of listening to your husband. What if the strangers are right and you're wrong? Then I'll apologize and support your success, David said without hesitation. But Emma, the probability of that happening is so small that it's not worth organizing our lives around it. But what if I need to organize my life around it? What if this is who I am? David's expression grew pained. Then we have a problem, because the woman I married was practical, realistic, someone who understood that dreams have to be balanced with responsibility. If you've changed into someone who prioritizes fantasy over reality, then maybe we need to seriously evaluate whether we want the same things anymore. The conversation felt like a line being drawn in the sand. On one side was the life David envisioned, safe, predictable, built around his definition of success. On the other side was the life I was beginning to want, uncertain but authentic, focused on creative fulfillment rather than financial security. I don't want to choose between my marriage and my writing, I said quietly. I'm not asking you to choose, David replied. I'm asking you to be realistic about what your writing can actually accomplish. Write as a hobby by all means, but don't sacrifice our future for something that has virtually no chance of providing financial stability. That night I lay awake thinking about David's ultimatum, even though he hadn't phrased it as one. He wanted me to keep writing small, to treat it as a leisure activity, rather than a career aspiration. He wanted me to accept that my dreams were less important than his comfort with our status quo. But Jennifer Martinez had a different vision for my future. Her latest email had contained exciting news. She was ready to submit my novel to publishers. Emma, the revisions are excellent. You've addressed every concern I had, and strengthened the manuscript considerably. I'm confident we have a book that editors will respond to. I've prepared a submission list of 12 editors at major publishing houses who acquire women's fiction. I'll send out the first round on Monday. This is where things get exciting. Hold on to your hat. Best, Jennifer. I stared at the email for a long time, trying to process that my novel, my actual novel, would soon be sitting on editors' desks at real publishing houses. Places like Random House, HarperCollins, Simon & Schuster, companies whose books I'd been shelving at the bookstore for years. The gap between David's expectations and my reality was widening into a chasm. On Monday morning, as David left for work with his usual warnings about staying grounded and managing expectations, I received another email from Jennifer. First round of submissions is out. Now we wait. Try not to check your email every 5 minutes. I know it's impossible, but try. These things can take anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months for responses. The waiting is the hardest part, but it's also when anything can happen. Keep writing. Start thinking about your next project. The suggestion thrilled and terrified me in equal measure. Jennifer was already thinking beyond this book, already assuming I would continue writing regardless of what happened with my debut. The confidence was intoxicating. Over the next 2 weeks I checked my email obsessively while trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy. David, meanwhile, had settled into a pattern of polite disinterest punctuated by occasional reminders about backup plans and realistic expectations. Then on a Thursday afternoon, Jennifer called. We got our first response, she said without preamble. My heart stopped. And it's a pass, but it's a good pass. The editor loved your voice and the emotional core of the story, but felt the market was too crowded for this type of book right now. Oh, the disappointment was immediate and crushing. Emma, this is actually encouraging news. When editors take the time to write personalized rejections, it means they see real potential in your work. This is the kind of feedback that leads to offers from other editors. Really, we're just getting started. 11 more editors to hear from. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table processing my first professional rejection. It hurt, but not in the way I'd expected. Instead of feeling defeated, I felt oddly encouraged. A real editor at a real publishing house had taken my work seriously enough to provide thoughtful feedback. That evening, David asked about my day with the careful tone he'd been using since my novel went out on submission. Any news from your agent? We got our first response from a publisher. David's expression immediately grew sympathetic. And they passed, but the editor wrote a really encouraging rejection letter. Emma, David said gently, A rejection is a rejection, you can't reframe it as good news. But Jennifer says this kind of feedback is actually positive. Jennifer is paid to keep you hopeful. David interrupted. Her job is to make you feel good about the process so you'll keep working with her. But the bottom line is that a publisher said no to your book. 11 more publishers still haven't responded, and they'll probably say no too. David's voice wasn't cruel, just matter of fact. Emma, I'm not trying to hurt your feelings, I'm trying to prepare you for reality. But as I looked at David across our dinner table, I realized that his version of reality and mine were no longer compatible. He saw my rejection as proof that his doubts were justified. I saw it as evidence that I was playing in the right league, even if I hadn't won yet. The gap between us was no longer just about writing, it was about how we approached life itself, whether to focus on what could go wrong or what might go right. And for the first time in our marriage, I was choosing optimism over security. Whether David could live with that choice remained to be seen. The call came on a Tuesday morning in May, exactly 6 weeks after my novel had gone out on submission. I was at the bookstore, helping Miss Rodriguez with inventory, when my phone rang. Jennifer Martinez's name on the screen made my pulse spike immediately. Emma, Jennifer's voice was different, electric with excitement. Are you sitting down? Should I be? Bethany Chen at Meridian Publishing wants to buy your book. The words hit me like a physical force. I sat down heavily on a stack of book boxes, my vision going slightly fuzzy around the edges. She wants to what? Buy it, publish it. She called me this morning and said she stayed up until 3 a.m. reading, because she couldn't put it down. She wants to make an offer. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared beside me, her face concerned. Emma, what's wrong? Someone wants to publish my book, I whispered, still trying to process Jennifer's words. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes went wide. Oh my God, Emma, we need to talk details, Jennifer continued on the phone. Can you call me back in an hour? I want to walk you through everything. The offer, the timeline, what happens next. After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence among the book boxes. Mrs. Rodriguez was practically vibrating with excitement. A publisher wants your book. Emma, do you understand what this means? Not really, I admitted. I feel like I'm going to throw up. You're going to be a published author. Your book is going to be on these shelves. Miss Rodriguez gestured around the store. Oh, I can't wait to hand sell your novel to every customer who comes in here. The reality was beginning to sink in. My novel, the story I'd written in secret, the dream David had dismissed as impossible, was going to become a real book. People I'd never met would read Sarah Chen's story. My name would be on a cover. When I called Jennifer back an hour later, the details felt surreal. Meridian Publishing was offering a 2-book deal worth $75,000, not enough to quit my day job immediately, but substantial enough to change everything. Bethany Chen, the editor, wanted to publish The Invisible Woman the following spring, and was already excited about my next novel. She loved Sarah's journey, Jennifer explained. She said, it's exactly the kind of book women are hungry for right now. Stories about finding your own power after years of being diminished by others. What happens next? Legal review, contract negotiations, editorial discussion. But Emma, the hard part is over. You sold your first novel. You're officially a professional author. That evening, I drove home in a daze. David's BMW was already in the driveway, which meant he'd had a good sales day, and left work early. I found him in the kitchen, opening a bottle of wine to celebrate a large commission. Good day? He asked, holding up the bottle. Want a glass? David, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. I need to tell you something. Sure. He poured 2 glasses of wine, clearly in an excellent mood. What's up? A publisher wants to buy my novel. David's hand stopped mid-pour. What? Meridian Publishing. They're offering a 2-book deal. A 2-book deal for what? For my novel, and my next one. $75,000. David set down the wine bottle very carefully. Emma, are you sure? Are you sure? This is real. Jennifer called this morning. The editor stayed up all night reading because she couldn't put it down. $75,000. Split between 2 books, paid out over several years. But yes, David sank into a kitchen chair, staring at me as if I'd announced I was leaving for Mars. I don't understand. This isn't supposed to happen. What do you mean? I mean, the odds were impossible. You said yourself you were rejected by 43 agents. The statistics on publishing success are terrible. This isn't supposed to happen to people like us. People like us. Regular people. People without connections or platforms, or, I don't know, whatever it takes to succeed in publishing. I sat down across from him, studying his face. Instead of excitement or pride, I saw confusion and something that looked almost like betrayal. Are you happy for me? I asked. Of course I'm happy for you, David said quickly, but his tone suggested otherwise. It's just unexpected. I need time to process this. David, this is what I've been working toward for over a year. This is why I've been getting up at 5 a.m., why I've been so focused on my writing. I know that. Intellectually, I know that. But Emma, I spent months preparing for you to fail. I spent months getting ready to help you move on from this dream. I never actually prepared for you to succeed. The admission hung in the air between us. David had been so certain of my failure that my success felt like a personal affront to his worldview. So what happens now? He asked. Now I work with an editor to revise the book for publication. I start working on my second novel. I become a professional writer. And your job at the bookstore? I'll probably keep it for now. The advance gets paid out over time, and I need the steady income while I build my writing career. David nodded slowly, but I could see him calculating something behind his eyes. 75,000 isn't actually that much money, spread out over several years. No, it's not, but it's a beginning. And what if the books don't sell? What if this first success doesn't lead to anything else? The questions felt like cold water thrown on my excitement. I don't know, David. What if they do sell? What if this is the beginning of something amazing? I just think we need to be realistic about what this means, David said, reaching for his wine. One book deal doesn't make you Stephen King. I never said it did. I'm just saying, don't let this go to your head. You still have responsibility. We still have a mortgage, and bills and a life to manage. I stared at my husband, realizing that even my success couldn't change his fundamental need to diminish my achievements. Whether I failed or succeeded, David's response was the same: to minimize the significance of whatever I accomplished. I should call my parents, I said, standing up. They'll want to hear the news. Sure, David said, returning to his wine. Just remember to keep things in perspective when you talk to them. I called my parents from the bedroom, closing the door behind me. Their reaction was everything David's wasn't. Pure joy, excitement, pride in my accomplishment. My mother cried. My father said he'd always known I had it in me. We're so proud of you, sweetheart, my mother said. When will the book come out? Next spring. Jennifer says there's a lot of work to do between now and then, but it's really happening. Are you having a celebration? You should definitely celebrate. I thought about David downstairs, treating my book deal like an unexpected inconvenience, rather than a life-changing achievement. Maybe, I said. I'm still processing everything. The next morning, David was unusually quiet over breakfast. He read the newspaper with intense focus, as if the sports section contained the secrets of the universe. Everything okay? I've been thinking about your book deal, he said without looking up. And I think we need to establish some ground rules. Ground rules for what? David folded the newspaper and faced me directly. Emma, this windfall is nice, but it can't change our fundamental approach to life. We still need to be practical, still need to focus on building long-term security. It's not a windfall, David. It's income from my work. Whatever you want to call it. The point is, we can't let this temporary success make us lose sight of reality. What kind of ground rules are you talking about? Well, for starters, I think we should put most of the advance money into savings. Build up our emergency fund, maybe contribute more to retirement accounts. Practical things. Some of that money needs to go toward my writing career. Research trips, conference attendance, professional development. David's expression hardened. Emma, you got lucky once. That doesn't mean you should throw money at trying to get lucky again. It's not luck, David. It's work. And investment in my career. Your career is working at a bookstore. This writing thing is a side hustle that happened to pay off once. The dismissal was so casual, so automatic, that it took my breath away. Even with a signed contract from a major publisher, David still couldn't acknowledge writing as my legitimate career. I need to get to work, I said, standing up from the table. Emma, David called after me. I'm not trying to rain on your parade. I'm trying to make sure we don't make financial decisions based on emotions. But as I drove to the bookstore, I realized that David's reaction wasn't about financial prudence. It was about control. As long as my writing was unsuccessful, he could position himself as the realistic one, the practical one, the adult in our relationship. My success threatened that dynamic. Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting for me with a bottle of champagne and a small stack of books. I know it's early for champagne, but this is a once-in-a-lifetime moment, she said, beaming. I also pulled some books by other authors published by Meridian. I thought you might want to see what kind of company you'll be keeping. I flipped through the books' beautifully designed covers, compelling back copy, authors whose names I recognized from bestseller lists. The reality of joining their ranks felt both thrilling and terrifying. How does it feel? Mrs. Rodriguez asked. Surreal, exciting, overwhelming. And David? How's he handling the news? I hesitated, not wanting to dampen Mrs. Rodriguez's enthusiasm with the truth about David's reaction. He's processing it, I said diplomatically. Mrs. Rodriguez studied my face with the perceptiveness of someone who'd been observing human nature for decades. Sometimes the people closest to us have the hardest time with our success. They've gotten comfortable with who they think we are. What do you do when that happens? You decide whether you're going to shrink back down to their comfort level, or whether you're going to keep growing and see if they can catch up. That afternoon, Jennifer called with updates on the contract negotiation. The conversation was full of industry terms I was still learning: subsidiary rights, royalty rates, marketing budgets. But what struck me most was how Jennifer talked about my future. She assumed I would continue writing, continue publishing, continue building a career as an author. Bethany wants to schedule a call next week to discuss your second book, Jennifer said. She's hoping for something in a similar vein, another story about women finding their power. I've been working on some ideas. Perfect. The market is really responding to these kinds of stories right now. You're in an excellent position to build a strong backlist. After hanging up, I sat in the bookstore office, thinking about backlists and career trajectories and the future Jennifer was describing for me. It was ambitious, exciting, full of possibilities I'd barely dared to imagine, but it was also a future that assumed I would prioritize my writing career over David's comfort with our status quo. For the first time since receiving the good news, I wondered if my marriage would survive my success. That evening, David was waiting for me with takeout dinner and a more conciliatory attitude. I've been thinking about what I said this morning, he began as we ate. Maybe I was too quick to dismiss your achievement. Thank you. I guess I'm just worried about what this means for our relationship. What do you mean? David set down his fork, choosing his words carefully. Emma, you're going to be traveling to book events, spending time with other writers, getting pulled into a world I don't really understand. I'm worried about us growing apart. The concern seemed genuine, but I could hear the subtext. He was worried about losing control over our shared narrative. I want you to be part of this journey, I said. I want to share this with you. I want that too, David said. But I need you to promise me something. Promise me that no matter how successful this gets, you won't forget who you were before. You won't forget that your marriage is more important than your career. The request felt like a trap, disguised as love. David was asking me to promise that I would never grow beyond the version of myself he was comfortable with. I can promise that our marriage is important to me, I said carefully, but I can't promise to stay exactly the same person I've always been. Why not? Because people are supposed to grow, David. They're supposed to change and evolve and become more themselves over time. David's face darkened. What if the person you become isn't someone I want to be married to? The question hung in the air like a threat. I looked at my husband across our dinner table and realized that we were negotiating the terms of a marriage that might not survive my transformation into the person I was meant to be. I guess we'll have to find out, I said quietly. And for the first time since my book deal, I wondered if success might cost me everything I thought I wanted to protect. Working with Bethany Chen at Meridian Publishing was like stepping into a parallel universe where my thoughts and ideas were not only valued but actively sought after. Our first editorial call lasted 2 hours, with Bethany asking detailed questions about Sarah's motivations, her relationship dynamics, her emotional journey towards self-discovery. The authenticity is what makes this work, Bethany explained. Her voice warmed through the phone. Readers can tell when an author has lived some version of what they're writing about. Your insights into how women lose themselves in relationships that diminish them. It's powerful because it's real. I was sitting in my car outside the bookstore during my lunch break, taking notes on everything Bethany said. The editorial process was revealing layers of my own story that I hadn't fully recognized while writing. For the revision, Bethany continued, I want to explore Sarah's professional life more deeply. The way her husband undermines her career ambitions mirrors what happens in the marriage, and I think strengthening that parallel will make the book even more impactful. That makes perfect sense, I said, already seeing how the changes would improve the novel's structure. I'm excited about your second book too. Jennifer mentioned you're working on ideas that continue exploring similar themes. Yes, I'm thinking about a story involving a woman who discovers her husband has been sabotaging her job applications for years. Oh, that's fascinating. The intersection of personal and professional undermining. There's so much to explore there. Can you send me a synopsis when you have one? After the call, I sat in my car for several more minutes, overwhelmed by the professional respect I was experiencing. Bethany treated my ideas as if they had inherent value, as if my perspective on women's experiences was worth analyzing and amplifying. The contrast with David's dismissiveness was becoming impossible to ignore. That evening, I found David in his office, reviewing dealer incentive programs for the quarter. His world of sales targets and commission structures suddenly felt small compared to the creative universe I was entering. How was your day? He asked without looking up from his spreadsheets. I had my first editorial call with Bethany Chen. She wants me to deepen certain themes in the revision. More work. It's not work when you love what you're doing. It's collaboration. David finally looked up. Emma, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. Okay, how much time is this book thing going to take? I feel like I never see you anymore. You're either writing or talking to your agent or researching publishing stuff online. When does it end? It doesn't end. Dave, this is my career now. But what about us? What about our life together? I sat down in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where I'd tried to explain my dreams so many times before. I want us to have a life together, but I also want that life to include my writing career. And if I can't handle that? The question was direct in a way David rarely allowed himself to be. Usually, he disguised his ultimatums as practical concerns or loving guidance. Then we'll have to figure out what that means, I said honestly. David closed his laptop with deliberate care. Emma, I married someone who was focused on our relationship, on building a life together. I didn't marry someone whose primary focus was a career that takes her away from me. I'm not trying to take myself away from you. I'm trying to become more myself. What if the person you're becoming isn't compatible with being married to me? What if the person I was before wasn't really me at all? The question seemed to strike David as fundamentally unfair. His expression shifted from concern to something harder, more defensive. If you didn't want to be married to me, you should have figured that out before we got married, not after you decided to reinvent yourself as some kind of artist. I'm not reinventing myself, David. I'm uncovering who I was before I started trying to be who you wanted me to be. David stood up abruptly. That's not fair. I never asked you to be anyone other than yourself. You asked me to be realistic. You asked me to be practical. You asked me to give up writing because it wasn't a real career. Because it was. And just because you got lucky once doesn't change that. It wasn't luck, David. It was work. It was talent. It was persistence. It was everything you said I didn't have. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized from our worst arguments. Fine. You were right about the writing. You proved me wrong. Are you happy now? I'm not trying to prove you wrong. I'm trying to live my life. Your life, not our life. The accusation hung between us like a chasm. I realized that David saw my success as inherently selfish, as if pursuing my dreams was a betrayal of our partnership, rather than an expansion of what I could contribute to it. I should probably start dinner, I said, standing up. Emma, David called as I reached the doorway. I'm scared we're losing each other. I turned back to face him. I'm scared we never really had each other in the first place. The next few weeks brought a whirlwind of professional developments that made David's fears seem both more and less justified. Jennifer secured me speaking engagements at writing conferences, where I would discuss my journey from unpublished writer to debut novelist. A literary magazine wanted to interview me about the themes in my work. A podcast about women's empowerment asked me to be a guest. Each opportunity felt surreal and affirming. People wanted to hear my thoughts, my experiences, my insights. The shy woman who had been mocked at her own graduation was being invited to share her wisdom with audiences of aspiring writers. You're becoming quite the public figure, Miss Rodriguez observed as she helped me prepare for my first conference appearance. Are you nervous? Terrified, I admitted. What if I don't have anything interesting to say? Emma, you wrote a book that a major publisher wanted to buy. You clearly have something to say. The question is whether you trust yourself to say it. The conference was held in Boston, a 2-hour drive from home. David had been unusually quiet when I'd told him about the speaking engagement, asking only whether I was being paid for my time. It's not about the money, I'd explain. It's about building my platform, connecting with readers, establishing myself in the writing community. Everything is about money eventually, David had replied, even if it's not obvious at first. The morning of the conference, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting my blazer and practicing my key talking points. I was scheduled to speak on a panel called From Rejection to Publication: Persistence in the Publishing Journey. You look professional, David observed from the bed, checking his phone. Thank you. Just remember, Emma, these people don't know you. They're seeing you at the height of your success. Don't let their admiration go to your head. I won't. And remember that you're representing our family. Whatever you say up there reflects on both of us. The comment struck me as odd. I was speaking about my individual journey as a writer, not about our marriage or family life. But David seemed to view my public appearances as extensions of his reputation somehow. The drive to Boston gave me time to think about how much my world had expanded in the past few months. I was traveling to speak at conferences, working with editors and agents, connecting with other writers. My universe had grown from the small triangle of home, bookstore and laptop, to include publishers in New York, conferences across the country, readers I'd never meet, but whose lives my work might touch. Meanwhile, David's world remained exactly the same. The car dealership, his commission targets, his familiar routines. His universe hadn't grown. Mine had just moved beyond its borders. The conference was everything I'd hoped it would be. The panel went well, with audience members asking thoughtful questions about persistence, revision, and finding your voice as a writer. Afterward, several aspiring authors approached me with their own stories of rejection and determination. Your novel sounds like exactly what I need to read, one woman told me. I've been invisible in my marriage for so long, I forgot I had a voice of my own. That's exactly why I wrote it, I replied, and meant. The connection between my story and her experience felt profound, meaningful in a way that sales figures couldn't capture. During the lunch break, I called David to update him on how the morning had gone. That's nice, he said, his voice distracted. Listen, Emma, I've been thinking about something. What? My college reunion is next month. I'd like you to come with me, but I need you to tone down the writer thing while we're there. Tone it down how? Just don't make it the focus of every conversation. These are people I went to business school with. They're not going to be impressed by book deals and conference speaking. David, this is my career now. It's not something I can just not mention. I'm not saying don't mention it. I'm saying, don't make it your whole identity. You're my wife first, a writer second. The ranking felt like a slap. Those aren't mutually exclusive roles. They are when one of them makes you forget about the other. I looked around the conference center, watching writers and industry professionals networking. sharing ideas, building careers. These people understood that creativity and ambition were valuable traits, not character flaws to be managed. I should go, I said. The afternoon panel starts in 10 minutes. Emma, David said, his voice softening. I know this is important to you. I just want to make sure it doesn't become more important than us. It's not more important than us, but it's equally important. I don't know what that means. It means I need both things to be happy, my marriage and my career. And if you can't have both, the question felt like a trap, but also like an invitation to honesty. Then I guess I'll have to choose. And which would you choose? I looked around the conference center again, at the life I was building, the person I was becoming, the dreams I was finally living. I hope I never have to find out, I said, and hung up. The afternoon panel was about building a sustainable writing career, and I found myself taking notes, as much as contributing to the discussion. Other authors talked about the importance of setting boundaries, protecting creative time, and not allowing outside pressures to diminish their commitment to their work. The people who love you will want to see you succeed, one established author said. If they don't, you have to ask yourself whether they really love you, or just their version of you. The comment hit me like a revelation. David loved his version of me, the practical, supportive wife, who didn't threaten his sense of being the successful one in our relation. But did he love the actual me, the woman, who dreamed big and worked hard and was finally achieving those dreams? On the drive home, I thought about the question I'd avoided answering when David asked it. Which would I choose? I'd always assumed that love meant never having to make that choice, that the right person would support your dreams rather than compete with them. But what if I'd married the wrong person? What if David's inability to celebrate my success wasn't a flaw to be worked around, but a fundamental incompatibility that would only get worse as my career continued to grow? The thought was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. When I arrived home, David was waiting with takeout dinner, and what appeared to be a carefully prepared speech. How was the afternoon? He asked as we sat down to eat. Good. Informative. I learned a lot about building a sustainable career. About that, David said, setting down his fork. I've been thinking about what we discussed earlier, about choices and priorities, and I think we need to see a marriage counselor. The suggestion surprised me. David had always been skeptical of therapy, viewing it as an admission of failure rather than a tool for improvement. Why the change of heart about counseling? Because I don't want to lose you, David said simply, and I can see that we're heading in that direction. If we don't figure out how to make this work, what would you want to accomplish in counseling? I want to understand how we can both get what we need, how you can pursue your writing career, without it destroying our marriage. The phrasing was telling. David still saw my career as a threat rather than an asset, but his willingness to seek help felt like progress. Okay, let's try counseling. Good, David said, visibly relieved. I've already researched therapists in our area. I found someone who specializes in career transitions and their impact on relationships. I nodded, wondering if a therapist would help David understand that my success wasn't something that needed to be managed or contained, but celebrated and supported, or if counseling would simply provide a more sophisticated framework for David to argue that my dreams were incompatible with our marriage. Either way, I was about to find out whether our relationship could evolve to accommodate the person I was becoming, or whether I would have to choose between love and authenticity. The stakes had never been higher. Patricia Summers had kind eyes and a no-nonsense approach that made both David and me comfortable during our first marriage counseling session. Her office was filled with books, psychology texts, self-help guides, and interestingly, several novels that I recognized from recent bestseller lists. Tell me why you're here, she said after we'd settled into her comfortable chairs. David leaned forward, clearly prepared with his talking points. My wife recently achieved some success as a writer, and it's putting strain on our marriage. I'm concerned that her new career is changing her priorities and pulling us apart. Dr. Summers nodded and turned to me. Emma, how would you describe the situation? I feel like my husband sees my success as a threat rather than something to celebrate. I've worked hard to achieve my dreams, and instead of being proud of me, he seems resentful. That's not fair, David interjected. I am proud of her, I just don't want her career to destroy our relationship. can you give me an example of how Emma's career threatens your relationship? Summers asked. David was quiet for a moment. She's always writing or talking to her agent or attending conferences. She's becoming this public person that I don't recognize. The woman I married was focused on our life together, not on building some separate career identity. Emma, how do you respond to that? I feel like David fell in love with a smaller version of me, someone who kept her dreams quiet and didn't challenge his role as the successful one in our relationship. Now that I'm actually achieving things, he wants me to shrink back down to who I was before. Dr. Summers made notes as we spoke. David, when Emma achieves professional success, how does that make you feel? Honestly? Confused. I spent months preparing to support her through failure. I never prepared for her to succeed. Why do you think that is? Because the odds were so impossible. Nobody makes it as a writer. I was trying to protect her from disappointment. But she did make it, Dr. Summers observed. How do you feel about being wrong? David shifted uncomfortably. I don't know. Like maybe I don't know her as well as I thought I did. Emma, how important is it to you that David acknowledge your success? Very important. For years he's positioned himself as the realistic one while dismissing my dreams as fantasy. Now that I've proven him wrong, he won't admit it. He just finds new ways to minimize what I've accomplished. Give me an example. When I told him about my book deal, his first response was to remind me that $75,000 isn't that much money. When I spoke at a conference, he warned me not to let the attention go to my head. He can't just be happy for me. Dr. Summers turned back to David. David, can you see how your responses might feel dismissive to Emma? I'm trying to keep her grounded. Success can be intoxicating, and I don't want her to make decisions based on temporary highs. What decisions are you concerned about? I don't know. Leaving her job at the bookstore before her writing income is stable, traveling too much for conferences and events, changing who she is based on other people's approval. Emma, are you planning to make any of those decisions? I am planning to build a writing career, which might eventually include leaving the bookstore and traveling for professional reasons. But those feel like natural progressions of success, not reckless decisions. Dr. Summers leaned back in her chair. It sounds like you both have valid concerns, but you're approaching them from very different perspectives. David, you seem to view Emma's success as inherently destabilizing. Emma, you seem to view David's caution as controlling. Is that accurate? We both nodded. Let me ask you this, David. What would Emma's success have to look like for you to feel comfortable with it? David thought for a long moment. I guess, quiet success that doesn't change who she is or how much time she has for our relationship. And Emma, what would David's support have to look like for you to feel fully loved? Enthusiasm, pride, encouragement, to reach even higher rather than warnings to stay small. Dr. Summers made more notes. I'm seeing a fundamental incompatibility in how you both view ambition and growth within a marriage. David, you seem to believe that dramatic personal growth is threatening to relationship stability. Emma, you seem to believe that lack of growth is threatening to personal authenticity. Is that fair? Again, we both nodded. We'll work on this over several sessions, Dr. Summers said, but I want you both to think about something. What are you willing to change about yourselves to make this relationship work, and what are you not willing to change? The drive home was quiet, both of us processing what had emerged in our first session. That evening, David was unusually thoughtful. I didn't realize how much my responses were hurting you, he said as we got ready for bed, and I didn't realize how threatened you felt by my success. Maybe we can find a middle ground. Maybe, I agreed, though I was beginning to suspect that our differences were more fundamental than either of us wanted to admit. Over the next month, we attended 3 more counseling sessions while my career continued to accelerate. The galleys for The Invisible Woman arrived from Meridian Publishing. Advance copies of my book with the final cover design. Holding my novel in physical form was overwhelming. Seeing my name on the cover made everything real in a way that contracts and phone calls hadn't. David's reaction to the galleys was telling. It looks professional, he said, flipping through the pages. Very official. Are you going to read it? Of course I'm going to read it. I've been waiting to read it. But David never asked for a copy and I didn't offer. Somehow, The idea of him reading Sarah Chen's story with all its parallels to our own relationship felt too vulnerable, too exposing. Meanwhile, Jennifer was fielding interview requests and booking appearances for my publication tour. A major morning show wanted me to discuss invisible women in modern relationships. A women's magazine was planning a feature about debut novelists over 30. 3 different book clubs had already selected my novel for future discussion. "You're becoming quite visible for someone who wrote about invisibility," Mrs. Rodriguez observed with amusement. "It's surreal. 6 months ago I was just someone David called a failure at my own graduation. Now strangers want to hear my thoughts on marriage and personal empowerment. How does that feel?" Like vindication and terror in equal measure. The 4th counseling session brought a breakthrough, though not the kind either David or I had expected. "I want to try an exercise," Dr. Summers said. "David, I want you to describe the future you envision for yourself and Emma in 5 years." David straightened up, clearly having thought about this. "I see us in a larger house, maybe with kids. I'll be managing my own dealership by then, and Emma will have found a balance between her writing hobby and her family responsibilities. We'll be financially secure, settled, living a stable life. Emma, what's your 5-year vision?" "I see myself as an established author with several published novels. I want to be traveling for book events, connecting with readers, maybe teaching writing workshops. I want to be supporting other women who are finding their voices. I want to be someone whose work makes a difference." Summers was quiet for a moment. "Do you both see the challenge here? David, your vision has Emma in a supporting role to your success and your timeline. Emma, your vision has you as the primary architect of your own life. These aren't just different priorities, they're fundamentally different life philosophies. So what do we do?" David asked. "You decide which is more important, being right about how life should work, or being happy with how life actually works." That evening David was unusually quiet during dinner. Finally he looked up from his plate. "Emma, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course. If you had to choose between our marriage and your writing career, which would you choose?" The question I'd been dreading phrased as directly as possible. I set down my fork and looked at my husband. Really looked at him. "I would choose authenticity," I said finally. "What does that mean?" "It means I can't go back to being the person I was before. I can't pretend my dreams don't matter, or that my success is somehow selfish. If our marriage requires me to be smaller than I actually am, then our marriage is based on a lie." David nodded slowly. "That's what I thought you'd say. What about you? If you had to choose between controlling who I become and losing me altogether, which would you choose?" David was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said finally. "I honestly don't know." 2 weeks later, everything changed. The Invisible Woman was published on a Tuesday in March, exactly 2 years after my graduation ceremony. The reviews were overwhelmingly positive, with critics praising the authentic portrayal of a woman finding her voice after years of being diminished. But the real surprise came on Friday morning, when Jennifer called with news that would change everything. "Emma, are you sitting down? Should I be? Oprah's book club. She wants to make The Invisible Woman her next selection." The words didn't compute at first. Oprah's book club. The literary seal of approval that could transform a book from modest success to cultural phenomenon. "Are you sure? Her team called this morning. They want to schedule an interview for her show." "Emma, do you understand what this means?" I understood that it meant everything David had predicted was impossible, was about to become spectacularly real. The Oprah announcement came 2 weeks later, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Pre-orders spiked. Interview requests flooded in. Jennifer's phone rang constantly with offers for speaking engagements, movie rights discussions, and publishing deals for my future books. Within a month, The Invisible Woman hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. The woman David had called a failure at her graduation had become one of the most talked-about debut novelists of the year. David's reaction to my success was everything I'd expected, and worse. Instead of celebration, there was resentment. Instead of pride, there was bewilderment. Instead of support, there was a desperate attempt to maintain some sense of control over a situation that had spiraled far beyond his ability to manage. "This is insane," he said, watching me prepare for my appearance on Oprah's show. 6 months ago, you were nobody. Now you're on national television. I was never nobody, David. You just couldn't see who I was. Emma, you have to admit this is all happening too fast. You're not prepared for this level of attention. I've been preparing for this my entire life. The night before my Oprah appearance, David made one final attempt to maintain the dynamic that had defined our marriage for 5 years. When you're on that show tomorrow, he said, remember where you came from. Remember that all of this started with a supportive husband who gave you the freedom to pursue your dreams. I stared at him, amazed by his ability to rewrite history even as we were living it. David, you told me I was a failure. You spent months trying to convince me to give up writing. You never supported my dreams. You tolerated them, barely, and only when you thought they were safely impossible. That's not how I remember it. Then, your memory is conveniently selective. The Oprah interview was everything I dreamed it could be. We talked about finding your voice after years of silence, about the courage required to pursue dreams that others dismiss, about the specific challenges women face when they try to claim space for their ambition. What would you say to women who are married to people who don't support their dreams? Oprah asked. I thought about David, watching at home, probably cringing at whatever I was about to say. I would say that love isn't supposed to make you smaller. The right person will celebrate your growth, not fear it. And if someone claims to love you while consistently undermining your dreams, you have to ask yourself what exactly they're loving, you, or their version of you. The response to the interview was immediate and overwhelming. My publisher rushed additional print runs into production. Foreign publishers began bidding for translation rights. My agent fielded movie deal offers, but the most meaningful response came from readers, thousands of women who wrote to say that Sarah Chen's story had inspired them to reclaim their own voices, to pursue their own dreams, to stop accepting relationships that required them to be less than they were. I had become exactly what David had once mockingly suggested was impossible, a successful author whose work was changing lives. When I returned home from New York, David was waiting with divorce papers. I can't do this anymore, he said simply. You've become someone I don't recognize, and I don't think you want to be married to who I actually am. I looked at the papers, feeling something that might have been relief. You're right, I said. I don't. The house, the assets, we can work all that out fairly. I just want this to be over, David, I said, looking at the man I'd spent 5 years trying to please. Do you want to know the real irony? What if you had celebrated my success instead of resenting it? If you had supported my dreams instead of undermining them, I probably would have stayed small enough to make you comfortable. Your love could have been enough to keep me from becoming who I was meant to be. And now I know what it feels like to be proud of myself, and I'm never going back. 6 months later, I was living in a small apartment in Manhattan, working on my 3rd novel, and preparing for a book tour that would take me across the country. The Invisible Woman had sold over 1 million copies and been translated into 23 languages. Mrs. Rodriguez called me regularly with updates from the bookstore, where my novel was perpetually sold out and special ordered on a weekly basis. Any regret? She asked during one of our conversations. I thought about David, who had remarried within 6 months to a younger woman who worked as a receptionist at his brother's dental practice. Someone who would never threaten his need to be the successful one in the relation. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to make myself small enough to fit into his vision of who I should be. I thought about the woman who had walked across that graduation stage 2 years earlier, clutching a diploma while her husband mocked her dreams in front of a crowd of celebrating families. None, I said, not a single one. After all, the best revenge against someone who calls you a failure isn't proving them wrong. It's becoming so successful that their opinion becomes irrelevant, and sometimes the person you have to prove wrong is the one you marry. I had started as David's unemployable wife and become a best-selling author whose work was changing women's lives around the world. The transformation was complete, and I had never been more myself. The end. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.